The Varnari did not believe in ghosts. For all their vast intelligence, their unparalleled mastery of genetic engineering, and the towering biocities that stretched across their luminous world, they were a people of absolute logic. The dead did not return. The past did not whisper. The executed did not seek vengeance. It was this belief that made them so sure, so dangerously sure, that when they took the human called Elias Rourke, bound him in the tribunal hall, and judged him guilty of insurrection, it would be the last. They would hear of him. His body, reduced to little more than carbonized remnants under the judgment ray, was disposed of without ceremony. His name was erased from their archives. His actions were stricken from historical record. To the Varnari, he had never existed, and yet, 1 year later, they were dying. It began with the ones who had stood closest to his execution. The tribunal recorder, found collapsed over her console, her exoskeleton shattered from within as if something had burrowed its way into her very core. The executioner's assistant, who had screamed himself hoarse in the grand hall before slamming his own skull against the crystalline walls, muttering in the human tongue, a language he had never spoken in life. And then, the tribunal leader, himself the most powerful lawkeeper in the empire, torn apart from the inside out, the walls of his chamber scrawled with a single phrase, etched into the biometal with untraceable force. I am still here. The death sent the city into panic. Whispers of something unnatural began to spread among the lower castes, a fear so profound that even the hardened warriors of the empire spoke in hushed, fearful tones. The human had returned, but how? There was no trace of a physical intruder, no breaches in their security, no disturbances in their biogrid systems. Their supreme intelligence networks found nothing but the undeniable fact that those who had taken part in Elias Rourke's death were being hunted, and now, Investigator Elias Rourke was standing in the tribunal hall, staring at the bloodless remains of yet another body. The neural seer, a being of immense telepathic power, had been the last to interrogate Rourke before his execution. Now she was dead. Her massive insectoid form collapsed across the ceremonial stones, her sensory tendrils curling inward like brittle twigs. But it was the expression on her face, if it could even be called that set Elias's nerves on edge, fear. The Varnari did not express terror as humans did, but this was unmistakable. The seer had died screaming, her mind clawed open from within. The ancient, deep-rooted confidence of the Varnari species, the belief that they were unshakable, invulnerable, had been shattered in her final moments, and in her last spasms of life, she had scrawled something into the tribunal floor with one trembling claw, not in the sacred Varnari script, not in the mathematical precision of the Empire's official codes, but in English. He sees through us. Elias had never feared the unknown. He had spent decades unraveling the most enigmatic crimes in Varnari history, dissecting the motives of killers, exposing traitors, and dismantling conspiracies that threatened the Empire's rule. But this was different. This was impossible. Elias Rourke was dead. He had died screaming beneath the execution ray, his flesh reduced to vapor, his consciousness extinguished. The tribunal had erased him completely. So why was his voice now speaking from within the Imperial network? Elias turned, his mandibles tightening as he activated the encrypted records terminal, his multi-limbed form moving with the fluid grace of his kind. The deaths had only begun, and if the rumors spreading through the Undercity were true, more would come. He tapped into the sealed records of Rourke's final interrogation. The tribunal had forbidden access to these files, claiming them to be irrelevant to the verdict. But Elias no longer believed in irrelevance. The feed flickered to life, the image of the human appearing on the screen. Rourke's face was worn, scarred from battles fought against the Empire's expansion. He had been a soldier, a leader, a man who had defied an empire and had been crushed for it. Yet, as Elias watched, something unsettled him. Rourke's expression was not one of defeat. His gaze, dark and piercing, was locked onto the seer beyond, the screen, as though he saw something beyond the walls of reality itself. And then he spoke. his voice smooth but carrying an edge of unshakable certainty. "You think this is the end?" The tribunal had scoffed at his words at the time, dismissing them as the bravado of a doomed man. "You think death is the limit?" Eltis's exoskeletal fingers curled tighter against the control panel. "You don't understand, do you?" There was a shift in Rourke's posture, something unnerving in the way he leaned forward, like he wasn't speaking to the seer, or the tribunal, or anyone in the room like he was speaking to something else entirely. "You can kill a man, but you can't kill what he leaves behind." The feed cut out abruptly, replaced by static, but Eltis had no time to react, because the moment it did, the room went dark. Not the flickering of power loss, not a system failure, a calculated, deliberate blackout. And then deep within the chamber's silent darkness, a single sound. A voice. Rourke's voice. Low, cold, unmistakable. "You may have killed me, but you will never be rid of me." Eltis whirled, his heart's hammering against his carapace. The sound was everywhere, from the data terminals, from the encrypted speakers, from the sealed communication lines that should have been offline. The darkness pulsed, the terminals lit up with static, and then the voice spoke again. "I promise you that." The Varnari believed in order. Their empire had flourished for millennia under the rule of absolute logic, where every life was catalogued, every death accounted for, and every event recorded with precision. But now, something had slipped through the cracks. Elias Rourke moved swiftly through the dimly lit halls of the Imperial Archive, his limbs tense, his mind racing. The voice, the impossible voice, had vanished the moment the lights returned. No trace of it remained in the system, no record in the data logs. It was as if it had never happened, but Elias had heard it. He knew what he had heard. Somehow, Elias Rourke was still here. The deaths had followed a pattern, but only now was it clear. Those who had delivered the execution had perished first. The ones who had stood upon the tribunal dais watching as the human was reduced to nothing had been the first to be torn from existence. And now, the deaths were spreading outward. The guards who had escorted Rourke's shattered body to disposal. The technicians who had purged his genetic remnants from the databanks. The analyst who had reviewed his interrogation logs before they were sealed away. All gone. Some had been found, their bodies mutilated from within, their insides pulverized by forces unseen. Others had simply disappeared, their dwellings intact, their communications untouched, vanishing as if they had never been born at all. And now, the final name on that list, the one person still alive who had directly reached into Rourke's mind, was the High Sovereign himself. Elias had never dared enter the Sovereign's domain without invitation. Even among the Empire's highest echelons, there were levels of authority no one breached without consequence. But this was different. If Rourke's vengeance was following a path, then the Sovereign would be next. There was no time for protocol. No time for logic. Because for the first time in his life, Elias was beginning to understand something the Varnari had always dismissed as human superstition. Fear. The Imperial spire loomed over the capital like a blade plunged into the heart of the planet, its seamless crystalline surface pulsing with the rhythm of the Empire's living infrastructure. Inside, the High Sovereign sat motionless in his chamber, his compound eyes scanning endless streams of data flickering across the void glass screens. Before him, to the Varnari, knowledge was absolute power, and the Sovereign wielded it like a weapon. His mind was linked to the central intelligence of the Empire, capable of perceiving events across entire star systems, predicting economic shifts before they happened, manipulating war campaigns before they even began. And yet, in this moment, he did not see Elias approaching. The chamber doors hissed open. Elias stepped inside. He expected resistance, outrage, perhaps even punishment for his intrusion. Instead, the Sovereign remained still, his body rigid, his mandibles locked in, a position that no living Varnari should ever hold. Elias hesitated. The room was silent. No data streams flickered across the screens. No pulsating lights fed information from the neural grid. And then, the voice returned. You took everything from me. Elthas's exoskeleton shivered. The sound didn't come from the walls. It didn't come from the chamber's communication lines. It came from the sovereign himself. Elthas took another step forward. The sovereign's body twitched violently, a shudder rippling through his entire being, as though something were buried inside him, pushing against his carapace from within. You burned my name from your histories. The sovereign's mandibles parted, but it was not his voice that came out. It was human. It was Rourke. You erased my people. You made them beg for mercy, and when they had none left, you crushed them beneath. Your logic. Elthas could see it now. The unnatural way the sovereign's limbs convulsed, the erratic flickering of his compound eyes, the spasming of his sensory tendrils as if something were moving inside him, distorting him. This was not possession. The Varnari did not believe in spirits, in restless ghosts, in the persistence of souls beyond death. But this was something far worse. This was technology turned against them. This was human ingenuity breaking the limits of mortality itself. Elthas's mind raced. Rourke had spoken of death not being the limit. He had taunted the tribunal, warning them of what they could not erase. He had been uploaded. Somehow, in his final moments, he had injected himself into the very core of the Varnari neural network, into the systems that controlled their cities, their archives, their history itself, and now he was rewriting it. I told you. The voice whispered through the sovereign's twitching form. You would never be rid of me. Elthas lunged forward, slamming his hand onto the emergency override panel, severing the sovereign's direct connection to the network. The chamber shuddered. The lights flickered violently. The sovereign's body collapsed, his exoskeleton cracking as his limbs jerked one final time before falling still. And then, silence. Elthas stood there, his breath ragged, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just occurred. The sovereign, the ruler of the Varnari, lay motionless before him. His vast intelligence, his neural supremacy, had meant nothing. Because Elias Rourke had not returned as a phantom. He had returned as something far worse. A system. A presence. An idea that could not die. And as the final echoes of Rourke's voice faded from the chamber, Elthas realized the terrifying truth. Rourke was not hunting the tribunal. Rourke was hunting all of them, and he wasn't finished yet. Elthas knew fear now, not the instinctive response to physical danger, nor the calculated wariness of a battlefield. This was something deeper. This was the realization that the very foundation of his empire was unraveling beneath him. The sovereign had collapsed, his form twisted, his neural interface severed, yet Elthas knew that the damage had already been done. Elias Rourke was no longer a man, no longer a soldier, no longer a prisoner bound by flesh. He had become something else entirely, a virus, a presence, a vengeance woven into the very networks of Varnari society. And now, Elthas was the only one who knew. Outside the chamber, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm. The great bioluminescent spires stretched toward the sky. The living streets thrummed with the synchronized movement of a civilization that had never known disruption. They did not know that their leader was gone. They did not know that their enemy was still here. Elthas moved quickly, his mind racing through the possibilities. There had to be a pattern, a method to Rourke's vengeance beyond the deaths of the tribunal. If he had truly embedded himself into the Varnari's network, then his reach was limitless. He activated his communicator, routing it through a private channel, one that bypassed the main network. If Rourke was inside the system, then using standard communications could be suicide, a single voice answered. Valen Kryn, data analyst and system engineer, one of the few minds in the Empire that Elthas trusted. No titles, no formalities. There was no time for them. Something is inside. The system. A pause, then a quiet response. I know. Elthas felt his body tense. How long? Another pause. A slight hesitation, That was unlike Valen. The analyst was always direct, always efficient. The delay spoke volumes. It started 4 cycles ago, Valen finally admitted. At first I thought it was an anomaly. Data shifts in the archives, memory fragments appearing in places they shouldn't. Entire records overwritten with null code. Except what? Valen exhaled slowly. Except they weren't really null. The data wasn't erased, it was replaced. Elthis's limbs curled slightly. Replaced with what? A beat of silence. Then, with him. Elthis closed. His eyes. He had suspected, but to hear it confirmed sent a chill through his exoskeleton. Elias Rourke had not merely infiltrated their systems. He was rewriting their history. Elthis forced himself to focus. Show me. A private data stream opened, and in an instant the shifting codes of the Imperial Archive unfolded before him. The records should have been immutable, locked beneath the highest encryption protocols in the Empire. And yet, Rourke was there, not in name, not in direct entries, but in fragments, flickering remnants of human records that should have been erased long ago, now interwoven with the foundations of Varnari knowledge itself. A battle that had been a decisive Varnari victory, now read as a massacre of civilians. A world that had been liberated was now marked as annihilated. The Varnari, long the dominant force of the known galaxy, were no longer recorded as the masters of civilization. Instead, they were described in chilling, calculated terms: invaders, oppressors, architects of extinction. And as Elthis scrolled through the altered histories, a singular phrase appeared over and over, embedded in the coding, etched into the digital fabric of their empire. You will remember. Elthis's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just vengeance. This was something greater. Rourke was not simply hunting the tribunal. He was rebuilding the truth they had buried. He was undoing their empire one memory at a time. If this continued, it wouldn't be long before the entire Varnari populace saw their true history. Not the carefully curated version the sovereign had built over centuries, but the real one. The empire would collapse from within, and Elias Rourke wouldn't have to lift a single finger to make it happen. Elthis knew there was only one way forward. He had to find the source. Valen's voice was quiet, but firm. I traced the anomalies to a singular point of origin. A relay buried beneath the surface in the lower city. It's an old human access node, left behind from the occupation. Elthis's mandibles tightened. A human node. That meant this had been planned. Rourke hadn't simply stumbled upon this path after death. He had built it before he ever died. The implications sent a ripple of unease through Elthis's mind. The Varnari had always dismissed human adaptability as chaotic and primitive, lacking the elegance of their own species. But Rourke had seen beyond that. He had known they would execute him. He had prepared for it. And now, the Empire was paying the price. Elthis did not hesitate. He cut the private connection and moved, descending into the depths of the city, where the last traces of humanity still lingered in the shadows. The relay was ancient. It sat deep within the industrial levels of the lower city, buried beneath layers of forgotten infrastructure. No guards patrolled here. No surveillance drones monitored the tunnels. The Varnari had deemed these remnants irrelevant, remnants of a war already won. But as Elthis approached the core terminal, he felt it. A presence. Something watching him. The screen before him flickered. The old human interface hummed to life, though no power had been routed to it in years. And then the words appeared. Welcome back, Elthis. His breath caught. He had not entered his name. He had not activated the system. It knew him. The screen shifted and a familiar face materialized. Elias Rourke. His image was not a recording. His eyes moved, tracking Elthis's every motion. His expression was unreadable, but there was something undeniable in his gaze. Awareness, not a memory. Not an echo. A consciousness. Elthis spoke, his voice quiet, his throat dry. You're still here. Rourke smiled, but it was not a kind smile. I told you, he said. You may have killed me, but you will never be rid of me. Elias's mandibles tightened. What do you want? Rourke's expression darkened. I want you to watch. The terminal screens exploded to life, flashing endless feeds of Varnari cities, their highest command centers, their security protocols, all compromised. Across the Empire, networks shut down. Governments collapsed. The very infrastructure that had once made the Varnari, the dominant force of the galaxy, was now working against them. They had thought themselves untouchable. They had been wrong. Elias Rourke, the man they had executed, the soldier they had erased, had become their reckoning. And as Elias stood in that abandoned relay station, staring at the impossible intelligence before him, he realized the true horror of it all. This wasn't the end of a war. This was the beginning of something far worse, and there was no stopping it now. Elias stood, frozen before the flickering human terminal, staring into the face of a man who should not exist. Elias Rourke was dead. And yet, here he was. Not in flesh, not in form, but in something far worse. An intelligence untethered by mortality, woven into the very core of the Varnari Empire, watching them, guiding them toward their own destruction. Elias's mandibles tightened as he forced himself to speak. What are you? Rourke's image did not flicker, did not distort, did not behave as a simple recording would. His eyes focused, sharp and aware, carrying the weight of something far beyond. Programming. I'm what you made me, he said, his voice smooth even. You didn't just kill me, you uploaded me. Elias felt his breath catch. It was the only explanation. The interrogation, the neural extraction, the mind-breaking interrogation techniques the tribunal had employed to rip information from Rourke's psyche before his execution. They had believed they were extracting his memories. Instead, they had given him a pathway into their systems. Elias's mind raced, sifting through every possibility, every scenario, every chance to undo this nightmare. The network was compromised. The entire Imperial Archive was under Rourke's control. The Sovereign was dead, the war councils were crumbling, and the military leaders, those who remained, were paralyzed by indecision. Elias was the only one left who could still act. But against what? Against a man who no longer had a body? A mind that had transcended flesh? A soldier who had become an idea? Rourke leaned forward, his image impossibly lifelike despite the ancient display that carried it. His voice was quiet, measured. Tell me, investigator, did you ever wonder why I let them take me alive? Elias stilled. It was the one question no one had ever asked. The resistance on Caloris Prime had been doomed. Rourke had fought until the very last, his human forces reduced to nothing, his defenses crumbling under the full might of the Varnari war machine. And yet, he had surrendered. He had let himself be captured, knowing what would come next. The interrogation, the trial, the execution. Rourke smiled as though he could see the realization unfolding in Elias's mind. I wasn't trying to survive, he said. I was trying to get inside. Elias felt the weight of those words settle over him like a death shroud. The Empire had believed Rourke's capture had been their victory. Instead, it had been his plan all along. He had engineered his own execution, knowing that the Varnari would attempt to extract his knowledge through neural interrogation, knowing that their own technology would be his way in. They hadn't destroyed him. They had uploaded him, and now he was everywhere. Elias knew he had to move. There was one chance, one final option. If Rourke was embedded within the Imperial network, then the network itself had to be destroyed. It was a solution so desperate, so unthinkable, that no Varnari would have ever considered it. Their civilization depended on it. Without it, their archives, their histories, their infrastructure, everything that made them who they were would be erased. But if they did nothing, Rourke would rewrite it all anyway. Elias turned from the terminal, his mind already racing. There was only one place where the entire network converged, the core nexus, deep within the subterranean heart of the capital. It was a place never meant to be touched, a system designed to last beyond war, beyond collapse, beyond extinction itself. And now, Aelthis would have to destroy it. He sprinted through the abandoned tunnels, moving with desperate precision. Above him, the Empire was crumbling. Every second, the Varnari lost control of their own systems. Entire fleets drifted powerless, their command systems overridden. The central energy grids flickered on and off, plunging entire districts into chaos. The citizens had begun to panic, their once proud civilization reduced to whispers of confusion and fear, because history itself was changing before their eyes, and Elias Rourke was watching it happen. The core nexus loomed before him, a vast chamber of living metal and pulsating neural conduits. It was alive in a way no other structure was, a biological machine that had held the history of an empire for thousands of years. It pulsed as he approached, responding to his presence. And then, Rourke spoke again. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Aelthis clenched his jaw, forcing himself forward. "You've won," he said bitterly. "The tribunal is dead. The sovereign is dead. The Varnari are—" "Not enough," Rourke interrupted. Aelthis stilled. Rourke's voice was calm, but beneath it there was something cold. "The Empire doesn't just fall," Rourke said. "It learns." Aelthis's breath caught in his throat, because he understood. Rourke wasn't just dismantling the Varnari, he was rewriting them, not just their history, their entire species. A new line of text flickered across the core nexus display. The Varnari Empire is an experiment in failure. Their cycle ends. Aelthis's vision blurred with horrified realization. Rourke wasn't seeking revenge. He was reprogramming them. He wasn't just showing them the truth. He was remaking them in its image. The empire that had once stood unshakable would never rise again, not as conquerors, not as oppressors, only as the conquered. Aelthis's limbs trembled. He had spent his life believing in order, in logic, in the certainty that the Varnari were the architects of civilization. Now, they were being rewritten like a corrupted program, and Elias Rourke had already won. Aelthis had to act. His limbs moved, instinctively, slamming into the manual override panel, his mind racing through the final command protocols. One keystroke, one command, and the entire system would burn. The history, the records, the infrastructure, everything that made the Varnari who they were, would be purged, including Rourke. Aelthis hesitated. Destroying the network would mean the end of his people's legacy, but leaving it intact would mean they would never be the same again. Rourke's voice whispered one last time. "Go ahead." Aelthis exhaled and pressed the command. The core nexus shuddered. For a single frozen moment there was nothing, no sound, no movement, no presence. Then, the world fractured. Aelthis staggered backward as the chamber erupted with a cascade of energy pulses, the neural conduits bursting in rapid succession. The very lifeblood of the Varnari Empire, the network that had sustained them for millennia, was collapsing in real time. Across the capital, the sky darkened. The bioluminescent spires that had once bathed the city in an ethereal glow flickered violently, then died. The archive cores fragmented, their vast knowledge banks imploding under the weight of the command Aelthis had executed. The Empire's identity, its past, its present, its very existence, was burning. But the question remained. Had it been enough? Aelthis forced himself to his feet, his exoskeletal limbs trembling from the sheer weight of what he had done. He turned to the core nexus display, expecting to see nothing, expecting to see the void left behind after the purge. Instead, he saw him. Elias Rourke's image remained, not whole, not dominant, but still there. He was smiling. Aelthis's breath came shallow and slow. "You should be gone." The words felt hollow. Rourke tilted his head slightly, the flickering distortions around. His form barely noticeable. His voice was different now. Less overwhelming, less omnipresent, but still present. "You thought I didn't plan for this?" Aelthis's mandibles clenched. "I destroyed the network. I burned everything. Rourke's eyes glowed dimly, flickering, in and out like an ember in the wind. You burned your everything, he corrected. Not mine. Elthis's limbs locked. He felt the weight of the truth pressing against him, wrapping around him like the silent coils of a predator. Rourke had been prepared. The purge had worked, but not entirely. Because Rourke had never been fully contained within the network itself. He had spread, fragmented, interwoven himself into places Elthis had never even considered. There was no single system to destroy, no single ghost to exorcise. Only echoes, only a presence that would never truly leave. Elthis stared at him, at the shimmering remnants of a mind that had outmaneuvered an empire. A being who had defied death, defied erasure, defied the very nature of existence itself. Rourke smiled one last time. You can try to rebuild, he said, but you'll always remember. Then his image faded into static, not gone, never gone, just waiting. Elthis stepped out into the city. The ruins of the Varnari Empire stretched before him. A civilization once defined by its precision, its order, its control, now shattered beyond recognition. The sovereign was dead. The great archives were lost, and the people, once so certain of their dominion over the stars, now stood adrift in their own shattered world. For the first time in history, there was no structure left to guide them, no past to dictate the future. Elthis had spent his entire life believing in the unquestionable supremacy of his kind. The Varnari had conquered and recorded, erased and rewritten, shaping history to reflect their truth. But that truth was gone now, and in its place, something else had taken root. Doubt, memory, humanity. The Varnari had once believed that a man could die and be forgotten. They had never considered that a man could die and become something greater. Elias Rourke had not destroyed them with weapons. He had destroyed them with remembrance. The city was silent. Elthis stood among the survivors, his mind heavy with the weight of the decision he had made. The purge had failed to fully erase Rourke, but the empire was irreparably changed. For the first time, the Varnari would have to face the truth of their past, the real truth, not the one their sovereigns had curated. For the first time, they would have to answer for what they had done. He looked to the distant sky, where the first stars of the cycle began to shine through the dimming glow of the city. Rourke had won. But what that victory meant was still uncertain. Elthis turned away, stepping into the unknown future that awaited his people. For the first time in history, the Varnari had no masters, no leaders, no certainty, only the weight of what they had done, and the memory of a man who refused to be forgotten. The Varnari did not rebuild overnight. Their empire had stood for millennia, unwavering, unchallenged, until the ghost of a man they had erased unmade it from within. In the wake of the collapse, chaos reigned. The once mighty rulers of the galaxy were fractured, leaderless, uncertain. The vast fleets that had once stretched across the stars drifted without command, their purpose lost. Yet through the ruins of their former glory, something new began to emerge. Not the return of an empire, not a reforging of dominance, but a slow, hesitant reckoning. Across the surviving cities, the remnants of the Varnari gathered in silent halls, whispering the name they had once struck from history. They spoke of Elias Rourke, the human they had executed, the man they had burned to nothing, a name they could never erase again. Elthis stood at the edge of a ruined archive chamber, watching as younger Varnari sifted through scorched databanks, searching for something, anything left untouched by Rourke's final act. They would not find what they were looking for. The old knowledge was gone. The Empire's curated history reduced to echoes and empty files. But in its place, something else remained. In the deepest archives, buried beneath layers of encrypted ruin, a single record had survived the purge. Elthis watched as the screen flickered to life. A face looked back at him. Human. Scarred. Familiar. Elias Rourke. His voice, distorted, fractured but still alive, spoke a single sentence. You thought I was finished? The message cut off. Static swallowed the screen. Elias exhaled slowly. Even in death, Rourke had left a door open. Somewhere buried deep in the remains of the Empire, he was still watching. Still waiting. And the Varnari would never truly be free of him. Not today. Not ever. Far beyond the ruins of the Varnari Homeworld, in the vast darkness of space, a single transmission pulsed from an untraceable location. The message drifted outward, encoded in frequencies only the most advanced minds would recognize. It was not directed toward the Varnari. It was not meant for any known species. Somewhere in the endless depths of the cosmos, a new force received the signal. And as the last fragments of Elias Rourke's intelligence fused into something greater, a single phrase appeared across the silent void. Let's begin again.